Maybe we can start.
Yeah.
Okay, so welcome everyone for joining this virtual seminar today. So we have one of our own today, Professor Ahmed Ghoniem. So he's the Ronald Professor here at MIT and also the director of the Center for the First Century Energy. So Ahmed, he got his bachelor and master from mechanical engineering at the University of Cairo. Then he moved to the US to University of California, Berkeley. And after that, he served in the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory for 3 years until he finally moved here to MIT and established the Reacting Gas Dynamic Laboratory. So he has been doing some interesting work on combustion dynamics. And I think that he's going to talk about that today and trying to use new approaches and new tools to help to understand the data that we get from simulations. So yeah, we are very happy to have you here. So yes, go for it.
Okay, thank you very much, Adrian. And thank you for the Center for Computational Engineering, Science and Engineering for inviting me to give a seminar today. And as I mentioned a minute ago, that's ironic that I'm giving this talk remotely, although I did ask to wait for a semester so that I can give it in person on campus. But at the last minute last week, I realized that I have to give another talk at 2 o'clock in Lexington. And I decided not to trust the traffic between Cambridge and Lexington around 1 o'clock. So I chose to give it in a place that's closer to the talk I'm giving in at 2. So with that, welcome everyone. And I'm going to talk a bit about a problem that we've been working on for a number of years, us and others, problems of combustion dynamics. How do we approach trying to either understand it mechanistically or predict it using simulation, and hopefully develop tools that we can control it. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge a significant number of graduate students and postdoctors who worked with me over the years, past dozen years or so. I couldn't remember all their names, so I put a picture that has many of their pictures. In fact, Kushal Kidia, who's here, unfortunately, his name did not go on the title page, but he was very prominent in developing the computational tools that we'll be using today. So I first start by saying, why are we still interested in combustion, especially in the age of decarbonization and moving to electrification? And I will answer that by saying that so far, with the significant implementation of renewable energy and electrification, still more than 80% of the primary energy produced around the world comes from combustion processes, whether it's burning fossil fuels or biofuels, whether it's in industry, transportation, or for any other application. Moving forward, things will change, but we still foresee a very important role for combustion in many applications, even with decarbonization. For instance, long distance transportation is likely to continue to rely on fuels. They will be probably biofuels, hydrogen, or other alternative fuels. It's very likely that carbon capture and storage, as it comes online, will continue to use one form or another of combustion processes, maybe oxy-combustion, maybe more traditional forms with post-combustion CO2 capture, so that will continue to require combustion technology in some form or another. And of course, any form of flights is very unlikely, especially long distance, to continue to be in anything but in using a combustion-based technology. So with that, we should say, again, with regard to technology, combustion technology is very old, depending on where you start, fire, all the way to burning supercritical fuels, which is very, very recent. Obviously, it adopted and it changed with time to address technologies, for instance, high efficiency, high exergy efficiency in particular for power systems or propulsion systems, and for reducing emissions, in particular NOx, And the problem of combustion dynamics I'm talking about today became very prominent when technology started to move towards low NOx technology, which is also known as lean premixed combustion. It continues to arise in many applications, as we will see, and it continues to demand solution, as again, we will try to highlight today. With the progress in combustion science, technology, obviously there has been parallel progress in combustion science. Depending on how you again count over the past 50 years or so, there has been very significant progress in 3 areas that fed into our better understanding and prediction of combustion phenomena. Analytical tools, basically primarily asymptotic methods for multiscale phenomena, which are very ubiquitous in this field. Laser diagnostics, optical diagnostics in many forms, which allow us to examine many microscale phenomena with very high spatial and temporal resolution. But first and foremost, of course, computation. When you start to integrate or attempt to integrate Navier-Stokes equation with reactive flows, have complex stiff chemistry with different resolution, obviously you must rely on high performance computing in different forms and different resolution. And as time went on, many of the tools that evolved in computational science were brought into combustion science to again help us learn more about what we are observing. One question that we're always asking, are we predictive yet? And I'm going to try to shed some light on that question as we move on. Now, for a complex phenomenon like combustion dynamics that we will describe in a second, we do need a very high resolution computing, but we also need to be able to validate these results. We also need to see the origin of the data somewhere from high resolution experiments. And we need to use some theoretical tools, models that will also help us explain what we're seeing in the computation and in the data. I call that throw the kitchen sink at it. If you have a complex problem, any tool you have, you can put in the mix to help you understand that is good. So that's what I will be trying to do today. We will show some experimental data with very high resolution diagnostics. We'll review some theoretical results from flame theory, in particular strain flame theory. Then we will look at computation, try to use tools to explain the data in the computation, and circle back to attempting to close the loop by thinking about a predictive model that can be used practically to solve these problems. Now, I chose to talk about dynamics. I chose to work during a good part of my career on dynamics for a number of reasons. Primarily is because dynamics always arises in interesting problems and comes in with significant juicy stuff in it that you want to dig into. It's likely to be in phenomena that cover many decades of scale. In combustion, we like to think that we deal with about 10 decades of scales in time and about, 10 to the power 6 million time scale ratio and about 10 to the power 5 length scale ratio. Typically, these phenomena go through transitions, and transitions are sometimes abrupt, bifurcating type transition that can lead to instability and dynamics. That indeed is the case in these problems of lean premixed combustion. When you try to reduce the fuel concentration in the reactive stream, you go through these transitions from stable to unstable systems. You do reduce NOx, but you have to deal with very high amplitude pressure oscillations. is being observed to occur over a very wide range of conditions. You change the fuel, you change the fuel concentration, you change the pressure and temperature, you change the geometry. Sometimes you don't change anything, just random perturbation in the system that triggers this instability. It has given many of us long careers of research, and I have to say it's still ongoing, although we're hoping that what we have seen lately and what I'm describing today will help put it in a different place than it was before. So now let me give you a couple of pictorial images on what combustion dynamics are. So this is what we call a step-stabilized combustor, where you introduce reactive flow from the top. You have a step here to create recirculation gases to help ignite the flame. And as you ignite the flame, you see that faded white. This is basically observation using a simple camera. The flame, lazy flame running around. As you change the condition by increasing the fuel concentration in the stream, things change drastically. You start seeing the flame running back and forth between the inlet section above the step to the downstream. You also observe that the pressure oscillations increase by an order of magnitude as we go through this. As you start looking with advanced diagnostics like PIV systems and PLIF systems that gives you a velocity map and a map of the species, you start seeing that this phenomenon we observed here indeed is associated with these flames lifting off the step and moving backward, and the velocity field following it. This large wake vortices growing and reaching size of the entire flame. As we started computing these flows at different equivalence ratios, indeed we saw that the equivalence ratios we observe in the experiment where this phenomenon happened, computation repeat the same thing. These flames tend to start to behave very interestingly. They start to creep over the step and move upstream. So that's just a kind of a manifestation of what we observe in step-stabilized combustors. Those of you who do propulsion will associate step-stabilized combustors with things like ramjet engines. This is another manifestation of the same thing. This is a gas turbine combustor. That's a swirl stabilized combustor. This is a model that we have in my lab. When again, we take pictures or movies under condition of stability, we see these flame dancing, oscillating. Had I had some sound in here, I would have been able to let you hear the sound. Lord Rayleigh in the late 1800s, when he started looking at describing these phenomena, he called them flame dancing and flame singing. We do have the singing in these experiments, but unfortunately, I don't have the sound, or you can't at least hear the sound that I'm hearing on my laptop. This is a computational realization of the same thing that we will get to in a second. Now, having seen these phenomena in the lab, as the fuel concentration or the equivalence ratio increases, we started thinking of what is the underlying mechanism. Before we think about the underlying mechanism, we should mention a name that I have just mentioned, Rayleigh, who in 1878 formulated a very well-known criterion for the onset of combustion dynamics. He said that if the volume and time integral of the pressure oscillation and the heat release oscillation of the flame is positive, you should expect combustion dynamics. You should expect the flames to start to dance and sing. He used the word condensation, greatest condensation for the high pressure. If you add heat at the high pressure in the cycle and you subtract heat in the low pressure of the cycle, you should convert heat to work. That's also counter principle, by the way, that you all know about from thermodynamics. So there's no surprise here. Another way of saying the same thing, that there is a resonance phenomena that arises at some point where we have positive feedback coupling between combustion and acoustics. That the combustion or the heat pumps energy into the acoustic field and gives rise to the sound. What has baffled us all is the mechanism by which the acoustic perturbations can support or induce combustion oscillations. And that's what we call how and why. How do these acoustic perturbations lead to flame oscillations? Why does this happen? And when does it happen? And can we be more quantitative about when? So while we know that this is a way of diagnosing the sickness, the illness, we don't know where it comes from. Moving on, we started thinking of throwing the kitchen sink at this. We started looking at experiments with very detailed diagnostics, PIV and the plane, and PLIF that highlights intermediates in the flame like OH radicals, and a very detailed simulation, whether it's kind of LES type simulation or direct simulation, as we will show later in particular special cases. We did this because we wanted to determine not only mechanistically what's going on, but also trying to see whether we can define some scaling parameters for the conditions under which we can expect combustion dynamics to occur. That was really a novelty in the business. Nobody had ever thought before that you should be able to scale conditions, that you can relate transition from stable to unstable systems as some parameters, some controlling parameters reach certain values. So part of the reason why we wanted to do this extensive study is because we wanted to also be quantitative in terms of the scaling, but also wanted to study the problem mechanistically. So in this world stabilized combustor, when we start running it, we see that as we change the equivalence ratio, the amount of fuel in the system, and stop any kind of coupling between the flow and the acoustics, that can be done by making the combustor short, so the acoustic field does not couple with the combustion process. As we increase the equivalence ratio, the flame shape, or what we call the macrostructure of the flame, changes as you see from 1 to 4 in my diagram here. So it starts as a very long, lazy flame. As we increase the equivalence ratio a bit, it continues to be a long, lazy flame, but with a bulbous structure near the recirculation zone, towards breakdown zone at the section of sudden expansion. We increase it further, it takes on this form that's still somewhat longer with tails extending downstream. As we increase the equivalence ratio more, it becomes a lot shorter with burning in what we call the outer recirculation zone here in the step. We increase it further, the flame sits here for good as a very compact, very intense flame. Now, next to that, we went back to the coupled system, the combustor that was long so that the acoustic field can couple with the combustion process. And we were able to see the exact 5 forms or 5 macrostructures of the flame that we saw before. But now we see that the sound pressure level goes through a sudden increase as we go from what we call flame 3, which is this flame with a long tail, to the flame 4 with a flame that burns in the outer recirculation zone. That change in the flame shape is associated with it, an onset of combustion dynamics. So that was a very interesting and important revelation, that the flame structure itself determines whether it can couples with the acoustic field or not, and determines whether the overall system will be unstable or not. So the 2 questions we asked were, 1, can we scale the conditions at which this transition happens? 2, some fundamental combustion property. Second is, can we explain the mechanism by which this transition happens, if this transition is what controls the combustion dynamics. And the answer to the first question had to go through many, many experiments where we vary the fuel, so the fuel controls the flame properties, and we vary the inlet temperature, we vary the oxidizer, and we look at these transition states and quantify the equivalence ratio at which transition happens between the flame 3 and the flame 4 that you see here also in the blue, and document this in a way that will allow us to predict whether there is a scaling criterion. Where would the scaling come from? The scaling would likely come from the fact that the flames sitting inside this macrostructure at the very fundamental level behave like laminar flames, or at what we call strained laminar flames. Laminar flames in flame theory or combustion theory play a very important role because that's one of these canonical phenomena whose properties are very strongly tied to the governing processes, the coupling between the physics and chemistry. In fact, you can describe laminar flame propagation using the convection conduction reaction equation with 3 boundary conditions, second order 3 boundary condition. That means that the flame burning velocity, which is this S value here, is really an eigenvalue of that system. But as you put the flame in a flow, the flow starts to strain that flame. The flame aligns itself with directions of high strain, and the flow starts to straining it. Means that the structure of the flame will change because you're changing the convective diffusive balance within that structure. And the flame structure changes, the burning speed change. And in fact, as you strain it too much, the flame extinguishes, it goes out. It goes out because at some point, the balance between the reaction that releases heat and the diffusion that takes away the heat from a reaction zone is no longer possible, and chemistry can no longer burn the fuel, and the flame goes out. It's preceded by the drop in the temperature of the flame because chemistry is no longer fast enough to counter diffusion. And you see that the temperature of the flame going down, as we see in this plot, to a point where it can no longer sustain reaction, and you get extinction, and you get what we call extinction strain rate. So it turns out that these extinction strain rates are also eigenvalues for these phenomena that are associated with the fuel equivalence ratio and the operating condition. So that gives us sort of a clue to where we may want to go to scale the problem. In fact, a typical turbulent flame, as the experiment shows up here, is really nothing but a laminar flame that's stretched and bent around the turbulent structure. And the structure of the flame itself is nothing but a strained flame embedded within this structure. And the extinction phenomena happen as turbulence or the flow becomes strong enough for again, this balance between heat production in the reaction zone and heat being taken away from the reaction zone is no longer possible. We did a lot of studies to validate this concept as interaction between flame and flows, and it became one of the primary tools that we use. Any flame code you use, a good flame code you use with detailed chemistry and multi-component diffusion should be able to give you quantitatively the response of the flame to strain, both in terms of changing the burning rate as well as the value at which the flame will extinguish. And what you will find is that the value at which the flame extinguishes is definitely a function of the equivalence ratio, but it's a strong function of the composition of the fuel and its composition, and the oxidizer if you're using different oxidizer for the same process. So with that, we went back to the experiment and started calculating the strain that the flames are subjected to by taking the PIV result and measuring the the strain, substituting in this expression, calculating either extinction strain rate or consumption speed. And that allowed us to indeed scale these results that were obtained for different fuel composition into what looks like one single result, where we can quantify the transition by either the extinction strain rate or the consumption speed, instead by the equivalence ratio, which varies between fuel and another. Did the same thing for the swirl stabilized combustor, and we had the same result, that these data that were obtained for different fuels could be collapsed on one if we use strained flame consumption speed, or if we use an extinction strain to collapse the data. So that was a very nice result that came from the experiment, that indeed we can scale the data to a extinction strain rate instead of either the fuel type or the equivalence ratio or the operating condition. That wasn't good enough because we wanted also to understand what the mechanism was. So the experiment was run to follow the change in the flame structure from conditions of stable behavior to conditions of unstable behavior. And the unstable behavior here is shown, where the flame is not only sitting on this inner shear layer, but it's also sitting on the outer shear layer. And if you stare at the movie for a while, you will see how it starts by burning only inside, but then all of a sudden, the whole thing gets inflamed and you burn inside and outside. So mechanistically, the transition between flame 3 and 4 seems to happen as the conditions are such that the flame can not only burn the inner shear layer, but also burn the outer shear layer while it's spinning like mad because the swirling flew and we have vortex breakdown inside the core of the combustor. All of this was good as observation, both for transition as well as scaling. That required a better, closer look at what's going on to try to understand mechanistically why exactly would the flame want to jump from the inner shear layer, the outer shear layer at some equivalence ratio, and why would it do this for different fuels at different strain rates, extinction strain rates, and why is the extinction strain rate an important parameter for scaling? So all of these whys and whys and whys, we attempted to answer them by doing a large scale calculation for the exact same problem using basically an LES finite volume code. I can talk about the detail of the code later. Important thing to keep in mind is we're trying to resolve as many scales as possible, and we're trying to resolve some detail of the chemistry in the process. First thing we did is we compared the experimental results with the simulation results. Indeed, we saw all of what we saw in the experiment. We saw an inner recirculation zone, vortex breakdown. We saw an outer recirculation zone at the step, and we saw a jet in between, and we saw two shear layers. Also, we saw that as we change the equivalence ratio from lower values to higher values, the flame moved from being a long flame, what we call flame 3, extending downstream, into a short, compact flame burning both in the inner shear layer and outer shear layer. So there is the simulation is able to tell us very similar things to what we saw in the experiment as we change the condition. The experiment showed us that the spinning plays a very important role in determining how the flame is stabilized and how and when it jumps from one side to the other. So we started looking at the data. We started analyzing the vorticity field underlying the data using by now classical tools for doing this. And we indeed found a helical vortex core that initiates at the center body where the swirl veins are sitting, moves in, expands in the outer channel where the flame is stabilized, and spins like a corkscrew, literally touching the outer walls as it goes into the outer expanded channel. Now, this is for the vorticity field. So what now happens to the flame field? Here's a close-up of what's going on. Here is the corkscrew vortex. Here is the flame highlighted by a reaction zone contour. And here is the corkscrew vortex starting at the center body. And here you see where the flame is sort of hugging these shear layers, inner shear layers before transition. So we're starting to see things that kind of remind us what we saw in the experiment, but also gives us a better clues on potentially what is going on as we go into analyzing the data more. How do I analyze the data more? What I'd like to know is what happens to the reaction zone, the zone where the maximum heat release is as the equivalence ratio increases. And here is in this movie, you see we started the low reaction, low fuel concentration equivalence ratio, and we started increasing it gradually. And what you will observe is the reaction zone is jumping from inner to outer and ending up being compact, sitting in a kind of a folded structure very close to the step. We can do the same thing, but look at the temperature contours around the inner shear layer and outer shear layer. Inner shear layer now is hot, where the equivalence ratio is low. Outer shear layer is cold. Now we're increasing gradually the equivalence ratio. At some point, you will start to see the blue zone starting getting red because now it's being inflamed. And here it is. And the inner zone becoming small. And you have burning in inner zone and outer zone. So these are very similar results to what we saw in the experiment. That's all very good. It's not explaining in detail what's going on, but it's telling us that we are on the right track in terms of capturing the data we need to capture. To look at some quantitative data, now we look at both the XY plane and the YZ plane or RZ plane to see what happens again to the demarcation line between the fuel and the product, fuel being red and product being blue, as we increase the equivalence ratio. You see something is happening here. Here it is. At some point, the flame touches that outer recirculation zone or outer shear layer and start to engulf it. And that's really very much a key point in what we learn from the result. At some point, flame is able to inflame the outer recirculation zone. So instead of being pure fuel, all of a sudden you will see the fuel starting to disappear. It's going to become blue and the flame jumping with the spinning. Here's the spinning action, engulfing the outer recirculation zone. So the question we ask here is, did the flame propagate into this zone, or did something else happen that allowed it to exist in the outer zone that it couldn't exist before? In order to answer this question, we had to do a bit more diagnostics. So here is the geometry we have. Here is the flame contour, or a contour that represents what the flame looks like. And I'm going to start to run the movie here. You will see it's running, and we are also increasing gradually the equivalence ratio. Nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens until some point. At some point, you will start to see that engulfment and the flame moving from just the inner shear layer to also the outer shear layer. That point is associated with, if I advance here, I want to advance. That point is associated with a flames becoming stronger and stronger that they can survive the extinction strain rates in the outer recirculation zone. And when we plot the ratio between the local strain rate and the extinction strain rate, we see it decreasing as we increase the equivalence ratio up to this point where you get the transition, and up to the point, indeed, as you get to that transition, you see the flame going out from the inner zone into, or the inner shear layer into the outer shear layer, engulfing it and producing that new flame that we also saw in the experiment, compact, V-shaped, closer to the step. So the bottom line that we get from here is that the local strain history in the outer recirculation zone is key to predicting when the transition will happen. And the transition happens not because the flame is propagating faster, it is because it's getting strong enough that it can survive in places where the strain rates are high. That certainly explains to us why the strain rate was a good parameter to use for scaling the data. And now I show you what I think from a practical point of view, if I was a practitioner of this field, would be the most important result of this work. How do I put all of this together in sort of a performance curve, if you like, and say to the combustion engineers, if you design your combustor so that you are in flame 3, the combustor is stable. If it jumps to flame 4, it will go unstable. In order to do this, we need to plot a diagram from what we call a flame time scale, which is the 1 over the extinction time scale, and a flow time scale. In order to determine what the flow time scale is, we need to go back and remember what we learned from the data and the simulation. That the flow time scale is associated with the spinning shear layer or spinning helical vortex that carried the flame from the inner zone to the outer zone. The time scale associated with this, associated with vortex shedding along the shear layer, can be scaled for all the data that we have, both in the experiment and simulation, and will give us a certain Strohal number if you want to scale it, but would also give you a time scale if you want to use a time scale. The extinction strain rates, we've already computed them for the different cases we have, and we plotted these data for all the experiment and the simulations we had. They all fell in one curve. That curve divides the domain between a stable flame 3 and an unstable flame 4. So this to me is sort of the culprit of all of that understanding and a kind of a tool, if you like, that you can give to a designer to make sure that whatever they're designing will be a stable operating system. So this is being good result. Technically, or from the engineering science point of view, we also wanted to make sure that indeed that extinction strain rate quantity, or that these underlying flame structures in these fields is what determine whether the overall combustor is globally stable or not. So we did a bit more analysis. We look at the internal flame structure from the simulation data, plot on a phase plane the flame structure as, for instance, the concentration of fuel versus temperature for these two different flames, flame 3 and 4, and indeed they look very different. One of them has burning in one shear layer, and the other burning is extinguished because of the heat loss and interaction with the wall that prevented it from burning the outer layer, while the other one, flame 4, is much more compact and robust, and all the burning happens within the narrow structure of what we expect for a laminar flame. Again, why this is important, all of this explains why relying on the 1D strained flame to try to predict the behavior of the global behavior of the combustor made sense and gave us good scaling. Now, the scaling that we found was able to give us a demarcation between stable and unstable, and we wanted to know whether that scaling can apply to other observables. For instance, when people build these devices or run these experiments, you always want to know what is the length of the recirculation zone, this inner recirculation bubbles that forms because of the vortical breakdown in the spinning flow. And indeed, we were able to show in another calculation that the size of this inner recirculation zone can scale well with the extinction strain rate of the flame. Now, all of these are reacting flows, so there's a very strong coupling between the fluid dynamics that determine the recirculation zone size and the combustion process. Having seen all of this and having seen it in a turbulent flow environment, both calculation and experiment, made us think that we really wanted to be a bit more certain about whether these observations were due, for instance, the simulation, whether any kind of turbulence modeling or turbulent combustion modeling, whether there's any input that we put in had much to do with the results we're observing. So we decided to apply the same kind of analysis, but not necessarily for combustion dynamics, to laminar flame results, but multi-dimensional laminar flame results. And we went back to a code that we had developed in my group over the years for laminar, multi-dimensional laminar flame calculation, stabilized over any kind of flame holder that you can think of. These are laminar flame calculations, so these are direct simulation. They do have detailed chemistry. They have the state-of-the-art detailed oxidation chemistry, for instance, of methane. But because of the multi-scale complexity, they also have adaptive measure refinements and multi-scale projection, immersive boundary methods, because we wanted to couple the heat transfer within the flow, within the gas phase, to the heat transfer within the flame holder. That turned out to be a very important part of what we saw later. So having put together this code, we ran it for different equivalence ratio to see how flames behave under laminar conditions as you change the equivalence ratio. Well, what happens is the recirculation zone associated with the flow changes its size. There's a volumetric expansion that expands the flow. And of course, the flames start to react differently to the recirculation zone as you change the equivalence ratio. The flame is stable. It's anchored, sitting here. In the lingo of the combustion field, these stable flames have what's known as static stability. They survive the flow. They will blow out eventually if you decrease the equivalence ratio, but they survive the flow. And one question that we wanted to know is, why do they survive and how do they survive the flow? And if you zoom in here, you see that the flame is not really sitting on the bluff body. It's not sitting on the obstruction that we're putting in the flow. Is sitting off it. And one question that we wanted to answer is, why is sitting off that, and how far should it be in it? And whether these concepts of scaling that we discovered before in the turbulent flame case do apply. So we did things like scale the length of the recirculation zone, again, attempted to scale them versus different input parameter, or versus the extinction strain rate calculated for these flames. And indeed, the extinction strain rate was able to scale these data very beautifully. So again, that supported the idea that we found in the turbulent case, that the flame response to flow is, as embodied in the extinction strain rate, is an important canonical property. Where does the flame sit with respect to the anchoring body? Changes as you change the condition, as you see here. and has always been a mystery. Why does it sit here? Why doesn't it sit anywhere else? Remember that the body takes away some of the heat that's deposited by the flame here. There's coupling between the gas and the solid. That required diving a bit deeper in the thermochemistry of the problem, looking at the actual distribution of fuels inside the recirculation zone. Turns out that a fuel like methane, when you subject it to heat by combustion, it pyrolyzes, breaks down. And it breaks down to things like hydrogen and CO, which have different diffusivity. And as they start to interdiffuse within the recirculation zone, they create different local equivalence ratios than the nominal equivalence ratio of the flow. And the flame finds the point where the local equivalence ratio, effective equivalence ratio is maximum, and it starts there. So that was another nice discovery that we got from these results that told us something about where we should expect the flame to start, the tail end of it to be. The idea that the extinction strain rate is important was also borne out by looking a bit deeper into these results, looking at the flame, which shown here by the dotted line, looking at the strain along that flame, which is shown here along the flame, and looking at the local burning velocity along, or local burning rate along that flame. You see this strain dropping very, very quickly from the point of very strong shears, very strong flow here to much lower value downstream. We also see that the burning velocity is dropping almost perceptitiously in response to that flame as you get closer to the bluff body and nearly extinguishing at the end of the flame, at the root of the flame, very close to the bluff body. So again, that sort of supported the idea that these flames do, or these reacting flows really respond very readily to these interactions that will make flames either survive or die out. At some point, as you reduce the equivalence ratio to very low value, you go into what's known as the blowout condition, when burning is no longer possible and the flame falls on itself and disappears. So that was, again, a bit of a demonstration to how we go to the limit of all of these effects piling up, leading to the disappearance of flames. Now, I showed you some calculation and experiment in the turbulent flow regime and a lot of calculation in the laminar flow regime that allowed us to be a bit more rigorous in terms of both the modeling of the physics and chemistry of the problem as well as the computation. And we learned from the computation in the laminar case that the response of the flame to conditions very close to the anchoring point are important and are really determined by the fact that near the anchoring point, the fuel is subjected to heating before it mixes sufficiently with oxygen, and that leads to pyrolysis, leads to breakdown of the fuel, and leads to different behavior of this local zone than the overall or than the kind of the well-established zone downstream. So we went back to the LES codes and expanded one of the LES codes to add very detailed chemistry because pyrolysis is important. In fact, this calculation turned out to be one of the most expensive calculations we've ever done because we had to put in something like a GRI very detailed chemical mechanism into an LES code. The bottom line is, in terms of the result, is indeed, even under turbulent condition, you get significant pyrolysis or breakdown of the fuel at the early stages of the burning process that determines dynamics or the mechanics of flame anchoring or flame static stability near the anchoring point. So with that, I'd like to wrap up and give some time for questions. my conclusions are summarized in these two slides. One is, if you have a complex problems like dynamics with multiscale, with transition, it's very strong coupling, and you want to sort of break it down and reassemble, if you like, the underlying mechanisms, you should throw the kitchen sink at it. Experiments, very detailed, with very accurate diagnostics at the microscale, computing as much as you can afford, as well as modeling that sort of allows us to look at the data, whether of experiment or the simulation, and relate them to mechanistically to the physics and chemistry underlying these problems. What we found in this experiment is that the coupling happens as the flame structure itself transitions, as the equivalence ratio changes. We found that we can scale that transition point for any mixture we have, or at least the mixtures that we tried, the conditions we tried at, to the extinction strain rate, which is a canonical combustion property of the fuel you're using under the conditions you're using it. Found these transitions occur as the flame structure changes, as it jumps from the inner shear layer to the outer shear layer in this flow, and that this jump or that transition occurs because the flame becomes strong enough at some point that it can not only burn at the inner shear layer, but the outer shear layer, where the strains are very strong and would have otherwise extinguished it. All the analysis that we did following that showed that indeed these flame flow interactions can be very nicely encapsulated in this concept of strained flames or flame extinction. And that all of these results and data can be summarized in a plane that relates a flow time scale and a flame time scale that defines conditions under which you go stable versus conditions under which you cannot go unstable. Again, given the complexity of any problem that has so much turbulence as this problem, it's always good to go back to something where you can do things a bit more carefully, and for instance, under laminar condition. And interestingly enough, we were able to observe in a very different environment, very similar correlations, again, between the flow flame behavior and underlying physics that governs the propagation or extinction of these flames. Ultimately, all of this knowledge, again, is about not just mechanistically and kind of the sciencey bit of understanding what's going on, but also what we can take this data to, or where we can feed this data into being able to design cleaner burning systems that are also stable. So with that, I wrap up and finish and open the floor for questions.
Thanks a lot, Ahmed, for the presentation. So now you can just chime in if you want, if you have a question, or if you want to write the question on the chat, so we can do either way. So just go ahead with that. Before that, I have some question, a small question. It's more like a detail that I was wondering about. So you mentioned, when you talk about the internal flame structure, you mentioned that using the 1D laminar flame calculations, that seems to be working very fine. I mean, very well when you apply that to a case when you have a 3D turbulent flame. And I was wondering if that's expected to happen for some regimes of the flow, or because that's obviously you derive that under some assumptions. And I suppose that there might be some regimes in which those are going to break. So that's the first question. The second one is that when those assumptions break, is that really relevant for any engineering application where you cannot anymore use the 1D laminar flame and you really need to move to something slightly more sophisticated?
Very good question. Yeah, very good question. So the reason why we believe in many of these applications that we talked about here, that the underlying laminar flame should be able to tell us something about the behavior of turbulent flame, is things like these, right? So this looking at the microstructure of a turbulent flame, you see basically a flame wrapping around turbulent structure. Our own data for, again, looking at images, PLIF images that highlight OH, which is a radical that always appears in this problem. Again, you see a flame structure that is very much like a line wrapping around a whole bunch of eddies. So under these conditions, it's not at all unreasonable to approximate what's going on here as a flame, a kind of a laminar-like flame that is just simply being grabbed around and being strained and curved and torn apart by turbulent eddies. Of course, as you increase the turbulence intensity more and more and more, you probably will get to a place where that no longer is possible. As you go to extreme Reynolds numbers, where turbulence intensities are so much higher than the flame can survive, it will no longer survive, it will break up. There's another model in combustion theory called well-stilled reactor that was developed basically to try to describe this. Now, under what condition in practice do these things can be found? Not too many. It's very difficult to get to a place where you can have such intense turbulence that you will be totally breaking down the flame structure and tearing it up and turning it into something well-stilled reactor. Could happen. I mean, I'm not totally ruling it out, but I'm saying that within the range of condition where you don't tear up the flame structure completely, break it down into small bits and pieces of reactant and products running around, using a laminar flame, strained laminar flame, to describe the underlying interaction between the flow and combustion seem to work well.
Thanks a lot. And thanks a lot for the talk. So very interesting. Anybody else? We have maybe time for one question or two if anybody wants to ask. If not, I also have another curiosity when you mentioned that some of these, in particular, when you have the combustion, that some of the models could be very expensive for LES because of the kinetics, and that the gold standard actually that is used for the methane kinetics in LES, that's really very expensive. And when you say very expensive, so what is the scale that we are talking about? Is this that really is orders of magnitude more expensive than if you use a different model that is not the gold standard?
Yeah, again, another good question. So when you do LES, the absolute majority of the time, you are probably going to use one of two approaches. Either a one-step reaction or something like a 2-3 step reactions, which means that you're going to have to carry 2-3 different scalars in your flow for transport, or you're going to have to use what's known as flamelet models, where you prepare this data for the flame structure itself by doing offline lots and lots of calculation for different flame structures at different strains or different equivalence ratios or different what's known as mixer fractions. You prepare this data offline, put them in some kind of a table or some analytical formulas, and use them as the input to LES, trying to avoid the idea of being able to calculate the local source term, the local production term, in your equation at each point, at each time step. What we did was use another approach to this called the embedded flame, or just to give you the exact one instead of. So it's artificially thickened flame is another way of mentioning it, of describing it. This model allows you to calculate the flame structure in real time, given the condition at each cell, if you like, or at each point in your flow. So it allows you to use any level of chemistry detail in calculating the local burning rate at each point in your flow. You can use a one step or 2-3 steps, and this is cheap because, again, you're carrying, not cheap, I mean, cheaper, because you're carrying or transporting 2-3 species. Or if you really are ambitious and want to look at the impact of the complex chemistry going on, then you can use a very detailed chemical model, 100 or 50, 60 species and whatever reaction steps that you need to use. In this case, you're going to have to transport all of these species. So you're going from transporting 2-3 scalars into transporting 50 scalars. And that's where the scaling comes from.
I see what is the problem there. I think we have a question from Sid, so just go ahead. Or do we have a question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Ahmed, this is Sid Yip. Nice to
Hello,
say.
Sid. Yeah.
I want to go back and ask you a very simple question to linking up different communities. Okay, I can understand your lecture from the standpoint of simulations, from the standpoint of asking for mechanisms. But if I were a materials person, I think of the system, your system is a system of particles, reactants, if you like, right? And for reactants, for particles, we have positions, we have velocities, those we can talk about. But you talk about flame. Now, flame is a variable that those of us who are not in combustion don't normally think of. So how would you characterize flame as a physical variable you can measure, you can model, you can simulate?
So flame, well, thanks for the question, Sid. That's an interesting question. So a flame is nothing but a reaction zone.
Okay.
So if you have a fuel and oxidizer, or any two molecules that can react under a certain condition, if you let them react, convert molecule A and B to molecule C, this is a chemical reaction happening somewhere in the field. The field around that reaction point is governed by the diffusion of the material that will react to that zone and the diffusion of heat away from that zone. Okay. So when you combine the transport region, the reaction diffusion region, with the reaction region, we call that a flame.
Okay, so yeah, if I may follow up on what you said. So, we also discretize our systems so that we can talk about what everybody calls a representative volume element. So if I can now think about what you're saying is that let's think in terms of representative volume elements so that we can talk about zone. And then we can talk about whether in that zone is the temperature high enough so you can talk about flame versus extinction. So, and this is a apparently very simple gap we have to cross over in order to communicate. And I don't mean to say that we have to do it now, but I'm reminded by the fact when in the old days when you and I talk about vortices, and you still talk about vortices, because when you start talking about zones, then you can now talk about flows and vortices. And we were also wondering, even those early days, the difference between, or the analogy between vortices and dislocations, which a large community also talk about. So, you know, some of these basic mechanistic terminologies or concepts are always with us. And it's just nice to see when you're talking about what you have done all these years, I'm still reminded of the fact that, you know, some of those earlier questions we asked, they're still around, and we might want to kick them around when we have a chance. Hopefully we will have a chance. But anyway, that's what I thought I would like to say, that, you know, I learned a lot from hearing you now, but I'm also remembering things that you and I talked about before. And those are questions are still fundamental. And they always go back to this thing about, you know, knowing what the mechanism is, but therein lies a sort of endless frontier of discussions for folks like us who are lucky to hang around long enough. Anyway, this is my way of saying hello to an old colleague.
Thanks for the comment. No, I'm delighted to hear that you still remember some of the old stuff that we used to talk about. Yeah. So and this, just to put things in context, today I wasn't really looking or digging deeper into the numerics. I was really using the numerics to try to learn a bit more about the physics and the chemistry and the phenomenology of you know, a problem that we've been interested in doing. But you're absolutely right. There is tons of underlying issues in the numerics that need to be addressed.
Okay, sounds good. So Ahmed, thanks again for giving the talk. It was nice seeing you virtually for now. Hopefully I can see you in person soon, one of these days.
Okay, very good.
And we wrap up here. Take care, all of you.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.